You can see it in the hollowed out factories, the boarded up storefronts, the faces of people who once had steady jobs and now shuffle through life wondering what happened. The American decline isn't some abstract theory, it's in the numbers, in the lives broken by an economic system designed to funnel wealth upward while telling those left behind that it's their fault. For 4 decades, the rules have been rigged, and the result is a country where a handful of billionaires hoard unimaginable wealth while millions struggle to pay for groceries or rent. Start with the basics. Productivity. Workers today produce far more than their parents or grandparents did. They're more efficient, more connected, more capable of generating wealth than any generation in history. But here's the kicker, they don't see any of it. Wages have stagnated, pensions have vanished, benefits have been slashed. The gains from all that extra work, they've been siphoned off, handed to executives and shareholders in a relentless transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top. Take the auto industry. Once a unionized factory job meant stability, a house, a car, maybe even a vacation. Now, those jobs are gone, shipped overseas, or automated out of existence. The towns that relied on those jobs, they're wastelands. And what did the people in charge say? They said, the economy is booming. They said, learn to code. They said, if you're suffering, it's because you didn't adapt. But that's a lie. The economy wasn't booming for workers, it was booming for the people at the very top, the ones who made sure the system worked for them and nobody else. And when people couldn't take it anymore, when the despair set in, what did they get? Not jobs, not investment, not healthcare. They got opioids, they got addiction, they got a death toll that rivals war zones. Over 100,000 dead every year, not from some plague, but from deliberate neglect. Because it was cheaper to let people destroy themselves than to fix what was broken. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't some unavoidable shift in the global economy. It was policy. Tax cuts for the rich, deregulation for corporations, union busting, trade deals written by and for. Every step of the way, the people in power made choices that enriched a tiny elite and left everyone else scrambling. And now we're told to accept it, to believe there's no alternative, that this is just how things are. But that's nonsense. The wealth exists, the resources exist. The only thing missing is the will to demand something better. When the pain gets bad enough, people look for someone to blame. That's human nature. And when the system refuses to name the real culprits, when the politicians won't point to the corporations, the billionaires, the ones who actually caused the crisis, then someone else will fill that void. Enter the demagogue, the con artist, the man who knows how to twist rage into vote. He didn't create the anger. It was already there, simmering in every town where the factory closed, in every family that lost a son or daughter to addiction, in every worker who watched their paycheck shrink while the cost of everything else went up. He just gave that anger a target, and he made sure it wasn't aimed at the people who deserved it. Instead of blaming the CEOs who shipped jobs to China, he blamed China itself. Instead of blaming the Wall Street bankers who crashed the economy, he blamed immigrants. Instead of blaming the corporate lobbyists who bought politicians, he blamed the so-called woke. There was a masterclass in misdirection. Take the justified fury of millions and turn it against the powerless. And it worked, because when people are desperate, when they've been lied to for years, when no one in power has ever spoken their language, they'll grab onto anything that makes sense of their suffering. He told them, you're not failures, you've been betrayed. And in a way, he was right. They had been betrayed, just not by the people he named. Meanwhile, the real villains laughed all the way to the bank. The corporations kept outsourcing. The billionaires kept dodging taxes. The politicians kept taking their money and doing their bidding. And the people, they fought each other over culture wars, over identity politics, over anything that kept them from asking the real question, who's actually in charge here? The tragedy is that it didn't have to be this way. There was always another option. Instead of scapegoating, there could have been solidarity. Instead of dividing workers, there could have been unity. Instead of blaming immigrants, there could have been a demand for fair wages and strong unions so that no one native-born or not could be exploited. But that would have required honesty. It would have required naming the real enemy. And the people in power on both sides were never going to do that, because the real enemy isn't a foreign country or a marginalized group. The real enemy is the system itself, a system built to make the rich richer and the rest of us fight over scraps. Until that changes, the decline will continue and the demagogues will keep winning. There's a story they love to tell in this country, a story about who's to blame when things go wrong. And for decades, that story has had the same villain, the immigrant, the outsider, the one who doesn't belong. It's a convenient tale, easy to sell, easy to repeat. But like most convenient stories, it's built on lies. Let's start with the facts. Undocumented immigrants make up about population, 3%. That's it. Not an invasion, not a takeover, a tiny fraction of people, most of whom work longer hours for less pay in jobs nobody else wants. They pick the food you eat. They clean the offices where decisions are made about their fate. They build the homes they'll never afford to live in. And what do they get in return? Scapegoating, demonization, the blame for every economic problem caused by the people who actually run this economy. Because here's the truth. Immigrants don't set wages. They don't close factories. They don't decide to replace workers with robots. The people who do those things are the CEOs, the shareholders, the politicians who write the laws. But those people have money, they have power, they have lobbyists. So when workers get angry, when they see their paychecks shrinking, their jobs disappearing, the system makes sure they don't look up, makes sure they look sideways at the person next to them, at the person who speaks a different language, at the person who crossed the border out of desperation, not greed. And it works. Of course it works. If you can convince a worker in Ohio that his problem isn't the company that fired him and moved production to Mexico, but the Mexican worker who took his job, then you won. You've diverted rage away from the real thieves. You've turned victims against each other. The irony is brutal. The same bosses who hire undocumented workers because they'll accept lower pay are the ones funding politicians who scream about illegal immigration. The same corporations that rely on cheap labor are the ones bankrolling the rhetoric that blames immigrants for stealing jobs. It's a scam, a con, and the worst part, workers know it. Deep down they know. But when no one gives them a real alternative, when no one names the real enemy, what choice do they have but to believe the lie? So the cycle continues, wages stay low, conditions get worse, and the people at the top keep laughing, because as long as workers are fighting each other, they'll never unite against the ones who are actually robbing them blind. For most of the 20th century, the US was the loudest preacher of free trade. We wrote the rules, we pushed globalization, we told the world, open your markets, tear down your tariffs, let capital flow freely. And for a while it worked. For us, American corporations got richer. Wall Street boomed. The rest of the world, well, they were told to be patient. Their time would come. But then something funny happened. The student became the master. China, the country we lectured about playing fair, learned the game better than we did. They built factories. They invested in technology. They made things cheaper, faster, and sometimes better than we could. And suddenly the US wasn't the unbeatable champion of global trade anymore. It was just another player, one that wasn't winning. So what did we do? Did we admit that maybe free trade wasn't the perfect system we'd sold it as? Did we rethink the way corporations had used globalization to crush workers everywhere? Of course not. We threw a tantrum. We slapped on tariffs. We screamed about cheating and unfair competition like a sore loser who changes the rules mid-game. And who led the charge? The same people who'd spent decades telling workers that free trade was inevitable. The same elites who'd gotten rich off outsourcing. Suddenly, they were all for protectionism as long as it protected their profits, not workers' wages. Trump's fair trade rhetoric was just a cover, a way to pretend he was fighting for the little guy while his policies handed even more power to corporations. Meanwhile, China kept growing. They didn't fall for the trick of blaming outsiders. They doubled down on industry, on infrastructure, on long-term planning. And now we're stuck in the ultimate irony. The country we built up with our own greed, our own hunger for cheap labor, our own reckless capitalism is beating us at our own game. And the workers, they're still losing. because the problem was never really China. It was never really unfair trade. The problem was an economic system that treats labor as disposable, that values profits over people, that lets corporations play nations against each other in a race to the bottom. Until that changes, the tariffs won't matter, the trade wars won't matter, the decline will continue, and the people at the top will keep getting richer while the rest of us fight over who to blame. History has a rhythm. Empires rise, they peak, they overextend, and then they fall. But here's the thing about decline: no one in power ever admits it's happening. Not in real time, not when there's still money to be squeezed, wars to be fought, myths to be up. And right now, the United States is deep in that phase of imperial decay, where the only acceptable response is denial. Loud, violent, expensive denial. Look at the numbers. The US spends more on its military than the next 10 countries combined, nearly $1 trillion a year, while bridges crumble, hospitals close, and teachers buy school supplies out of their own pockets. That's not an accident. It's a choice. When an empire feels its grip slipping, it doesn't invest in its people. It doubles down on bombs. It doesn't rebuild factories. It builds more aircraft carriers, because admitting that the real threat isn't some foreign enemy, but the rot within, that's unthinkable. So instead, we get the spectacle, the endless wars, the manufactured crises, the sudden panic over Iran's nuclear program, which, by the way, doesn't exist, or China's aggression, which mostly consists of trading with countries we've spent decades exploiting. The politicians left and right perform the same tired routine. We must stay strong. We must project power. We must never show weakness. But weakness isn't refusing to invade another country. Weakness is needing to invade another country just to prove you still can. And the people, they're exhausted. They see the layoffs. They see the inflation. They see the opioids, the homelessness, the hollowed out towns. But the minute they start asking real questions, why are we spending billions on missiles while our kids go hungry? They're told they're unpatriotic. Or worse, they're told it's socialism, as if demanding health care and schools is the same as surrendering to Moscow. The irony is almost funny. The same elites who've shipped jobs to China, who've rigged the economy for the 1%, who've let the country's infrastructure turn to dust, they're the ones screaming about American greatness. But here's the truth they can't say out loud. Empires don't die because of external enemies. They die because the system that built them stops working for anyone but a handful of oligarchs. Rome didn't fall because the barbarians were so strong. It fell because the elites were so corrupt, so detached, so incapable of reform, that collapse was the only possible outcome. And now we're in the stage where the denial gets more frantic, where the military budget grows while the schools shrink, where the politicians blame everyone: China, Russia, immigrants, socialists, except the people who actually wrecked the country. Because admitting the truth would mean admitting that capitalism in its current form is a failed project. And that's the one thing they'll never do, not until it's too late. There's a reason the United States clings to Israel like a security blanket. It's not just about oil. It's not just about lobbyists. It's not even just about religion. It's because when America looks at Israel, it sees a distorted reflection of itself, a settler colonial state born in another era, desperately trying to pretend the world hasn't changed. Think about it. Israel was created in 1948, the last gasp of European colonialism, right as the rest of the world was waking up to the idea that maybe empires weren't so great after all. There's a project of displacement of walls of military dominance over a native population that never consented. And for decades, the US backed it unconditionally, not because it was morally right, but because it was politically useful. Israel was the perfect client state, armed to the teeth, hostile to the same enemies, and willing to do the dirty work of enforcing Western interests in the Middle East. But time moves on, the world changes. And now Israel isn't just an ally, it's a liability, a symbol of everything the global South hates about American hypocrisy, a country that lectures about democracy while enforcing apartheid, a regime so brazen in its brutality that even the US propaganda machine can't fully hide it anymore. And here's where the mirror cracks. Because the US is facing the same problem. We're a country built on stolen land, on slavery, on endless war, and the world is starting to reject our moral authority. We lecture about human rights while locking kids in cages. We sanction other countries for aggression while dropping bombs on weddings. We pretend we're the guardians of democracy while our own system collapses into corporate oligarchy. So of course we love Israel. It lets us pretend we're still the good guys, that the 20th century never ended. That might still makes right. But behind closed doors, even the elites are starting to waver because the calculus is shifting. China's rising. The global south is refusing to take side. And suddenly unconditional support for Israel isn't just morally bankrupt, it's bad for business. You can hear the whispers in DC now. Maybe it's time to cut them loose. Maybe we pivot to Asia. Maybe we ditch the Zionist project for a new empire in the Pacific. That's how desperate they are. That's how little loyalty this system really has. Because in the end, empires don't have friends. They have interests. And when the cost of supporting Israel outweighs the benefits, the US will drop it like a bad investment. Just like it dropped every other client state when they stopped being useful. The only question is who's next. There's a quiet but unmistakable shift happening in the halls of power. A slow turning of the ship that nobody in the establishment wants to announce too loudly. The same politicians who spent decades screaming about Iran's nuclear program, who swore undying loyalty to Israel, who draped themselves in the flag every time another Middle Eastern country needed bombing. Suddenly they're changing their tune. Now the rhetoric is different. Now the enemy isn't Tehran or Hamas or even Moscow. Now it's all about China. This isn't an accident. It's not some sudden realization that Beijing is a threat. It's a cold, calculated pivot, an admission without ever saying it outright that the American empire is no longer the undisputed global power it once was. For decades, the US could afford to police the world, to dictate terms, to bomb whoever it wanted with no real consequences. But those days are ending. The money isn't there. The influence isn't there. And most importantly, the economic dominance that made it all possible is slipping away. So what's the response? Not self-reflection, not reinvestment in the American people, not a reevaluation of the system that got us here. No, the response is to find a new enemy, a new justification for the same old game. And China, the country that actually makes things, that actually builds infrastructure, that actually invests in its workforce, is the perfect scapegoat. But here's the dirty little secret they won't say out loud. This isn't about national security. It isn't about democracy versus authoritarianism. It's about capital. It's about profit. It's about the fact that American corporations have spent the last 30 years outsourcing jobs to China, enriching executives while hollowing out the American middle class. And now that China is winning at the game we created, the elites are panicking. That's why the rhetoric is shifting. That's why the same politicians who swore blind allegiance to Israel are suddenly murmuring about reassessing priorities. Because at the end of the day, the empire doesn't care about ideology. It doesn't care about loyalty. It cares about control. And if supporting Israel becomes a liability in the new Cold War with China, then Israel will be tossed aside, just like every other ally that stopped being useful. And the workers, they'll be tossed aside too, because this pivot isn't for them. It's not about bringing manufacturing back to the Midwest. It's not about rebuilding unions or raising wages. It's about protecting corporate profits, about ensuring that the billionaires who run this country don't lose their place at the top of the global food chain. So we'll get more tariff, more sanctions, more saber rattling, maybe even a war if the desperation gets bad enough. But none of it will change the fundamental truth. The American decline isn't happening because of China. It's happening because the system is rotten, because capitalism in its current form has no answers for the people it's left behind. Until that changes, until we stop blaming foreigners and start blaming the system itself, the decline won't stop. It'll just get uglier.